At the beginning, there was debt. Not the kind that sits quietly in the background, but the kind that reshapes every ordinary day. Every envelope carried the same message. More time had passed. More money was owed. And less room remained to keep pretending it would solve itself. The numbers no longer felt abstract. They had become personal. Each total represented pressure, delay, and the quiet humiliation of being financially trapped. There was never enough. Not enough cash flow. Not enough time. Not enough distance between what was due and what was available. Debt changes more than a bank account. It shrinks choices. It turns simple decisions into calculations. It makes the future feel smaller. And yet, inside rooms like this, something powerful sometimes begins. Not confidence. Not comfort. Just the refusal to stay buried. Because when debt becomes impossible to ignore, it forces a confrontation. Something has to change. The old pattern can no longer survive. The first stage of change is rarely dramatic. It begins with looking harder at what was once avoided. The debt was real. The fear was real. But for the first time, so was the possibility of a different direction. Empire did not begin with money. It began with a shift in attention. The turning point was not a miracle. It was clarity. A painful, disciplined, unforgiving kind of clarity. For the first time, the numbers were not just frightening. They were informative. They pointed to leakage, weakness, and one small opening. It was not glamorous. It was not impressive. But it was repeatable. And repeatable things are where real money begins. Somewhere between desperation and discipline, the first workable idea appeared. Small enough to overlook. Strong enough to matter. Debt had forced attention. Attention was becoming structure. And structure, repeated long enough, starts to change outcomes. The first paid bill did not erase the problem. But it did something more important. It proved movement was possible. The amount was small. To outsiders, almost meaningless. But to someone trapped in debt, progress does not need to be huge to feel life-changing. Because the first gain is not powerful because of its size. It is powerful because it changes belief. The room still looked poor. The debt still existed. But the pattern underneath the room had already started changing. And that is how the climb began. Quietly. Without applause. Without anyone outside the room understanding what was happening. The first real system did not look like an empire. It looked like a few numbers that worked together better than the old life did. Small operations started replacing financial chaos. A process formed. Something could be bought, moved, improved, or sold with intention. What mattered was not scale yet. It was consistency. Debt had been built through repeated pressure. Wealth would have to be built through repeated control. At first, progress lived side by side with the old problem. Debt was still there. But now it had competition. Every small improvement reinforced the same lesson. Stability was not magic. It was design. The new system did not eliminate risk. But it reduced randomness. And that alone changed everything. One debt payment became another. The total still looked intimidating. But for the first time, it was shrinking instead of spreading. Progress often looks unimpressive in the middle. It feels slow. But what feels slow can still be transformative if it is moving in the right direction. Pressure had once controlled the room. Now the room was beginning to answer back with discipline. Empire was still nowhere in sight. But the foundation that makes empire possible had quietly begun. Momentum changes the emotional temperature of work. The same effort begins to feel different once the results stop being theoretical. More activity meant more confidence. More confidence meant better execution. And better execution created room for faster growth. This was no longer survival improvisation. It was a functioning system. A machine made of decisions, repetition, and patience. Debt had not vanished yet. But it was no longer the center of the story. The outside changes were still small. But small changes become meaningful when they are backed by direction. Success had not become luxurious yet. But it had become visible. With every layer of stability, new opportunities opened. New scale became possible. And the mind that had once been trapped by bills was now thinking in systems. One of the most powerful moments in any financial climb is the moment an old burden loses its power. Debt was no longer shaping every thought. It was being replaced by something stronger, momentum with memory. And once momentum becomes structural, growth begins to accelerate. Scaling does not feel like wealth at first. It feels like pressure of a different kind. More moving parts. More decisions. More responsibility. The numbers were larger now. The stakes were larger too. But this time, pressure was no longer the enemy. It had become fuel. The system that once handled survival was now handling expansion. Empire still sounds dramatic when spoken aloud. But in reality, it arrives through layers. One process after another. One solved problem after another. The room was changing again. This time not because debt had been escaped, but because scale had begun to reward itself. By now, wealth was no longer temporary cash flow. It had become position. The symbols of success started appearing. Not all at once. Not loudly. But unmistakably. And the strangest part was how quiet it still felt. From the outside, nothing looked explosive. But the underlying structure had become powerful. Debt had once consumed every decision. Now it existed only as memory, and memory had become motivation. The empire had begun. Not as fantasy. Not as noise. But as the natural result of pressure turned into structure, and structure turned into scale. By the time the outside world could clearly see it, the transformation was already complete. Debt was gone. Stability was established. Wealth had become undeniable. What once felt impossible had become operational. Money no longer arrived only to disappear. It stayed. It moved. It multiplied. The symbols looked impressive. But they were only the visible edge of something deeper. The real empire was process. Most people imagine empire as drama. In reality, it often feels like control. Quiet, layered, disciplined control. The debt phase had taught what pressure feels like. The empire phase taught what precision can produce. Because real financial power is not just about making money. It is about building something that continues to function even when emotion is removed. The old debt was not forgotten. It had simply been transformed into the foundation of a completely different life. What had once looked like small discipline in a poor room had become systems strong enough to carry scale. From the outside, people might call it an unbelievable rise. But inside the story, it was something simpler. A series of changes too small to impress anyone. Until they became impossible to ignore. From debt to empire sounds dramatic because it is. But the drama is not in the glamour. It is in the discipline that made the glamour possible. In the end, the story was never really about the skyline, the desk, or the visible wealth. It was about the way pressure reshaped thinking. The way desperation was forced to become attention. And the way attention became structure. Debt feels permanent when you are inside it. That is what makes stories like this powerful. They prove that permanence can be an illusion. The empire did not begin when wealth arrived. It began when chaos stopped being accepted as normal. That is why the most important part of the story is not the money. It is the moment the mind refuses to remain financially powerless. Because every empire that rises from debt begins the same way. With one room. One problem. One decision to stop drifting. And once structure takes over, progress becomes measurable. Once progress becomes measurable, belief becomes stronger. And once belief becomes disciplined, scale becomes possible. What looked like luck from the outside was mostly repetition from the inside. From debt to empire is not just a story of money. It is a story of what happens when pressure stops breaking a person. And starts refining them. He went from debt to empire not because the world suddenly became fair, but because he learned how to turn pressure into discipline, discipline into systems, and systems into wealth strong enough to change everything.